Thank you all for your patience and welcome to those who have just joined in to our webinar on our most recent tool, International Standards for Children Deprived of Liberty in the Administration of Justice. My name is Saray Garcia, and I am the Director of Juvenile Justice Advocates in Mexico. It is my honor to present to you our first panelist today, Mr. Douglas Keeler. He is the founder and executive director of Juvenile Justice Advocates International.
Thank you, Sarai. And I want to thank everyone who's taken the time today, this morning or this afternoon, or wherever you happen to be in the world, to join this publication launch for this really important tool. We're going to start out today just giving a little bit of background on the publication itself, how kind of where this project has come from, and then Sarai is going to kind of guide us a little bit on in the tool itself, how we as an organization have used it in our work in juvenile detention. And then we'll talk about some next steps and how whether you're part of civil society, whether you're a lawyer who represents youth who are incarcerated, or whether you are part of government agencies that operate facilities, or are part of probation or court system in your country or jurisdiction, or you just have a general interest in the topic, you're in the right place today. So thank you again for joining, and I'm going to go ahead and share the screen again and get people. Let's see. There we go. So the publication, International Standards for Children in Detention in the Administration of Justice, we'll have the QR code up on the screen a few times during the presentation today, and we'll be sharing the link. If you haven't had a chance to download it, we'll be sharing the link via email with those who've registered ahead of time. It's also available on our website, which is jjadvocates.org, either through the homepage or through our library of documents. It can be downloaded. So first, a little bit about our organization. Our organization is a relatively new organization. We have been around for 10 years now, and our organization has a mission to protect children and the rights of children who are in conflict with the law and minimize the deprivation of liberty. We work primarily in the Western Hemisphere. Our main office is in Mexico City with Sarai. We also have an office in the United States and have projects and activities throughout Latin America and the United States, primarily working with jurisdictions, directly with juvenile justice operators on projects to reduce the use of incarceration and improve conditions in detention facilities. So before we go too far, we have a little bit of background from the global study, the United Nations Global Study on Children Deprived of Liberty, and this was the first kind of thorough assessment and accounting of children who were deprived of liberty around the world. According to that study, there are, as of 2018, 410,000 children deprived of liberty in the administration of justice, and then with an estimated additional million children in police custody at any given time. So this breaks down approximately a quarter of these children are in prison or, have gone through a legal process and have been either adjudicated or convicted and given a sentence of incarceration, whereas about 3/4 of these children are in pretrial detention or have not yet had their case processed and are awaiting the completion. So that is a little bit of the breakdown of the most recent statistics we have at a global level of the incarceration of children, specifically in the administration of justice. So this does not include other forms of deprivation of liberty, such as immigration detention or other cases, children incarcerated with with their caregivers, with parents, those types of situations. And this is kind of how the rate of global detention breaks down around the world. And you'll, of course, with no surprise, see that the United States in particular is leading the world in incarcerating young people. Even though we've seen a significant decrease in the use of incarceration for children in the United States, still continues to far outpace the rest of the world. But at the same time, you also see the Western Hemisphere in general does have a higher rate of juvenile detention. The other kind of important point, I think, to understand is the post kind of COVID context now that we're living in. We've seen a lot of jurisdictions, whether it's individual jurisdictions within the United States or jurisdictions around the world, countries around the world, where the incarceration rate for youth tended to go down during the pandemic. I don't know that that's universally the case, but tended to go down during the pandemic. But then we've seen in many places a resurgence of the use of deprivation of liberty for children in conflict with the law, and in some cases exceeding the rates before the pre-pandemic rates. And so there continues to be a concern for prioritizing alternatives to incarceration. That's a lot of the work that we do, but also to ensure that children who continue to have to be incarcerated are treated humanely, ensuring that their human rights are guaranteed, and getting the services and care that they require while they are incarcerated. So to that end, that is kind of the purpose of this specific tool that we've put together. A little bit of the history of the international standards for children in detention and the administration of justice. When our organization began looking at what were different tools available, how could we, with the cooperation of justice officials, go into detention centers and ensure that children's human rights are being maintained, and building a working plan for the facilities that we operate in, to improve those facilities, identify needs of those facilities, and began looking at the different tools that are available around the world. The one that we kind of honed in on as one of the most thorough assessment tools was developed by the Annie E. Casey Foundation in the United States, called the JDAI Facility Assessment Standards. These are assessment standards that were developed a little over 25 years ago, and were specifically for sites where the Annie Casey Foundation was working with a program called the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative, JDAI. And these were jurisdictions in the United States, states or counties that had specifically raised their hands saying that they wanted to limit the use of juvenile detention and be kind of implement best practices in their juvenile detention system. So these were developed and began to be used on a voluntary basis, mostly conducting self-assessments. So these are not, in most jurisdictions where they're implemented, are not mandatory standards or required by the government or any sort of certifying or licensing agencies. Then we also looked at the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Of course, the United States is not a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so the Annie Casey Foundation standards did not incorporate, while many of the standards were very good and very thorough, did not incorporate or use the Convention on the Rights of the Child as kind of the basis. And so with that, then the applicable United Nations standards and rules, in particular the Nelson Mandela rules, looking at those, and then also the experience and expertise that we had. And there are also a number of other documentations and toolkits that have been developed by other organizations around the world in the last 5 or 10 years. In particular, I think the two that were probably the most key for us was Penal Reform International and the Association for the Prevention of Torture had put together a toolkit, a very thorough toolkit, in 2015, and then Defense for Children International in 2016 had a practical guide for monitoring places of youth detention, in addition to the recommendations and documentation that have been put out by organizations and bodies like the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, has a very thorough, had developed a very thorough juvenile justice summary of their juvenile justice jurisprudence. UNICEF guides, Committee on the Rights of the Child, Committee Against Torture, kind of all of those international instruments. And then what our organization and our team did was go ahead and kind of throw these all into a big kettle and mix them together. And so using kind of that the Casey Foundation standards as a structure within which to do that, but then building based using the Convention on the Rights of the Child as kind of the starting point, the building block for what standards should be included in conducting that type of assessment. The objective with our standards and the objective with the tool that we are releasing is to create systemic change in the detention system. So that is the ultimate goal of all of the work that we do as an organization, is to create change that is going to impact children's lives who are in the justice system. So as part of that, and as part of the work that we do with facilities, this tool is designed to partner with facilities. So there's other tools, especially things like the Defense for Children International tool that they had developed that's more for external monitors or more designed for that, or UNICEF has different tools that are kind of targeted more towards, say, a human rights ombudsman or someone who's coming in to do site visits at a facility as kind of an external, not even monitor, but external site visits to assess facility. How, what are types of questions that you would ask of staff or ask of youth to try to identify human rights abuses. That is not specifically the intention of this tool. This tool is designed, while it is very thorough and it is designed to identify human rights abuses, it's also designed to identify places where practices and protocols, training regimens, hiring of staff, and the facility and how it operates, how that's get a thorough understanding of how that's taking place. And in order to do that, you have to have the partnership of facilities. So it includes going through documentation, going through kind of having fairly broad access to the facility and its leadership in order to conduct that, but then with the ultimate goal of having the type of partnership that will result in working together after the assessment is completed to actually implement changes to policies and procedures. The standards are absolutely a high set of standards. I think it's important to understand that not all facilities, no facility would in our estimation meet all of the standards or are expected to. But kind of the hierarchy or the way that the standards have been designed and built are first based on international law, legal requirements. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child, jurisprudence from the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the Inter-American Human Rights System, and other bodies. Secondly, recommendations from those bodies. So the Committee on the Rights of the Child's General Comment 24, general comments from the Committee Against Torture and the Inter-American Commission, and then best practices. So again, those types of guidelines that have been published by other organizations, practices that we implement in our work. And so it's certainly not expected that every single facility, I think the baseline is that facilities are complying with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But they may not be implementing every single best practice that we've identified and included it in the standards in any particular area, or necessarily every recommendation that's put out by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, for example. But I think it's important to note that the Committee on the Rights of the Child has identified that juvenile justice is one of the areas of their work on children's rights where countries have the most difficulty complying. And so it's an area of high need. And so this tool specifically is holding facilities to that higher standard. But also part of our work is to identify kind of and prioritize where those improvements are needed the most in a specific facility. So with that, I'm going to hand this back on over to Sarai, who has done a number of facility assessments and probably hundreds at this point of facility visits around Latin America and around the world to kind of walk us through the standards and talk about how we envision this tool being used.
Thank you, Douglas. You can please go to the next slide. I would want to walk you through the tool. What areas are the standards covering? What do we mean by a standard? I think Douglas gave a great background in explaining that it's a bar it's a higher bar for children who are deprived of liberty, and kind of like what they look like and some important concepts that I believe are worth mentioning in this webinar. However, if those who are interested in downloading the tool, you will of course get to learn about all of the standards. So the standards cover 8 sections that we consider covers all the experience of youth coming into detention from the moment they step into the facility till they can go back to their communities. And this not only includes youth, of course, youth are at the center, youth and children are at the center of the standards, but it also covers their family members who are somehow also impacted by the justice system. So in our first section, our intake section, it is, of course, from the moment youth come into the facility. Sometimes those initial moments of arrest and confinement could be traumatic for children. More than often, arrests occur in settings that probably are violent or even more traumatic to children in youth, or youth could be under the influence of substances or already suffering physical injuries resulting from the incident that resulted in their arrest. So these initial hours are critical to preserve their mental health, to assess any kind of trauma that may have been inflicted upon them during the arrest or the whole experience, till the moment that they have a room assigned to them. And this chapter addresses all the steps that the facility should engage in to make this process minimally traumatic, but also compliant with national and international law. This initial steps cover things like protocols to identify torture or even low-level corruption in the happening of the arrest. Then we have the next section, which is the section that has the most number of standards, which is health and mental health. Children commonly arrive at the facilities with some previous medical or mental health conditions. And sometimes those conditions have not been assessed by the community services they may have access to. And so they need immediate attention when they get to the facility. Other children may have chronic medical and mental health needs, or even from their family health history, they may have some mental health or even just in general health needs that have not been identified or assessed properly in the past previous to coming into the facility. So in this section, while it covers a whole lot of medical standards, there are substantial standards that cover solely mental health and this mental health service and care for children, even to the point when they go back to the community and how are they referred to community services. Then we come to the section of access. And this section talks about all the access that children may have to outside of the facility in whatever way that may look. Obviously, respecting international law and the rights that children and youth deprived of their liberty have, like the right to visit with an attorney, with their attorney or their family members, and things like that. But also, this could include if they can get mail, if they can even like go outside of the facility. There is one facility in Mexico that allow children to go out, whether that's on a trip field or just experiencing certain sites in the city. It depends really on the context. but those standards are there to protect the safety of children, but also how can they still communicate to the outside world from detention. Then we go to the section of programming, and this addresses what does youth do? What do they do in the time during the day when they're not sleeping or having their meals? Is this program appropriate? Are these activities that they're doing guaranteeing rights like the right to education? Or are they just hanging out in their rooms? Do they have access to a court where they can exercise properly according to their age? And these standards, especially in Latin America, the term it's a coined term, and we talk about this measures. That's the little translation of what the kids have to do to comply with court orders when being in detention. So this famous medidas socioeducativas, which in Latin American world, it's a whole pack of activities that children should be doing in detention to comply with either a sanction or just certain activities during their pretrial detention. Then we move on to training and supervision of staff. Staff is critical when operating a detention facility, and these standards are focused in ensuring that the facility operates with order and responsibility, and obviously in protection of the human rights of children and youth. But staff should know, in order to know how to act in event of crisis or provide a better service to children, it's important that they continue to receive appropriate training for their very important work in the facilities. Then we move on to the section of environment, and this probably has the most number of what we call subjective standards. How does the environment in the facility feel like? But also some very on-point standards. For example, is the temperature of their dormitories appropriate? Is there appropriate light for them to do their homework if they have any homework? Are there any pests present in the facility? Anything that has to do with providing an appropriate environment to be able to provide an appropriate developmentally programming for children and youth, and also the staff. We have a whole section for restraints, solitary confinement, and room confinement. And if I were to mention something quite critical in these sections, is that we provide some guidance into the terminology of what do we mean by room confinement and solitary confinement and timeout. We've noticed that in some jurisdictions, these terms probably are not pretty well defined. And it's important that to have terms defined properly. Like, we consider room confinement to be an involuntary restriction of youth, of a youth allowed in a cell or room, but it may only be used as temporary response to behavior that threatens immediate harm to them, and it may never be used as punishment or disciplinary sanction. Never in a place where it's like dark and he's not able to communicate or see his peers or things like this. And then voluntary timeout, it's a brief period of time in a youth's room or other space requested by the youth. And the youth must be checked every 10 minutes, and this place cannot be locked. And then finally, solitary confinement, where we do not even present standards to how to use it. We believe should be eradicated practice from facilities. And then we move on to the last but equally important section, which is safety. And the standards are focused on ensuring a sense of safety in the most important prerequisite for a well-run facility, and harmony between staff and children. This section also establishes certain standards when it comes to the safety of the infrastructure of the facility. So with this very short in general overview, I would like to show you what do these standards look like. If we go to the next slide, we have chosen a section of food under the environment big section. This is what standards look like. And then if and when you download our tool, you'll notice that each of these subsections have their own references at the bottom. So these standards include both international law standards, but also best practices, and you'll be able to see that. I'm not going to go through each of these, but in the section of food, it's important to notice maybe the temperature of meals, or how many meals you'd have a day, and things like this. We move on to the next slide. So how do we use these standards? Within the standards, especially when you notice the reference section and you read carefully throughout them, some of them are like quite known standards for facilities of detention, whether they come from the Mandela rules or any other instruments that we currently have. But we have proposed a way to use these standards. First off, the tool, it's a general tool that has to be adapted to the specific jurisdiction. So the first step, if you are interested in using the standards, will be to contextualize to national law in the context of the country. Just to give you an example, and a quite debated topic would be solitary confinement. There are countries who allow solitary confinement, and it's written in their laws. Our standards prohibit it. So if you were to follow our standards solely, then it's a standard that you won't be able to comply. Yeah, it sets a higher bar, and jurisdictions overall should strive to eliminate that practice. But if it's allowed in national law, then those standards need to be contextualized to what facilities can actually and have the first obligation, which is the national law, and then the international standards. Other things like if the facility has the capacity to reject an intake because of the youth's safety. That's not possible. For example, in Mexico, once the court has assigned detention as a pretrial measure, then the facility has to comply and accept youth over any circumstance. Then once that has been covered and the standards are appropriate for that specific jurisdiction, then you could use this tool as a self-assessment or an external assessment. This tool, or further, if you're interested in further conversations with us, JJI, we can walk you in detail of this whole process. But a self-assessment would include the facility and some community partners to take this tool and apply the standards in order to see the level of compliance of the facility and what will be a plan to improve practices. And an external assessment would include an actor like us, JJI, alongside maybe other local actors or maybe other government institutions, whether that they come from the children's protection system or institutions of the like, to it be involved in kind of like the same process, but the facility is not directly involved in assessing standards. And this will be like the main difference. It's also important, if we go to the next slide, okay, to remember, I would like to, we still have some time, but we can go to the previous slide. This is very important to mention. I know to this point, for some of you, this may have been a lot of information. The tool is we believe robust enough to be worth diving in and studying and looking in detail to the standards. There is a considerable number of standards, but we've I think we've accomplished in making the tool as friendly as possible. But there are some things that, if we go to the next slide, that I would like to mention as well when using this tool or even just studying this tool. I know we have looked at what do we want to achieve with this tool. This is good to remind people who is now in this webinar, is the standards in this tool were created to kind of like shift this paradigm and notion that we've seen in so many countries and in so many facilities, that justice is detention. So we believe detention is not justice, and justice is not detention. When it comes to the administration of justice, detention is not our first option, and it's not the only option. We definitely believe that justice comes with responsibility, reconciliation, restoration, and reintegration. Yes, this is a whole tool that talks about detention, but just like the Committee on the Rights of the Child, we believe that anything that can be done in the community should be prioritized before the system can look into the option of depriving the liberty of children. However, if there is detention, then this is the tool that we recommend for jurisdictions to use in order to equip facilities in the best way. Now, I'm going to talk to you about some results that we've had in doing this assessments. And recently this year, we ran this assessment in a facility in Indiana. And that exercise was done in a self-assessment, kind of like mixed external assessment format. And now the facility is looking into ways to improve the practices in the facility. We also did this assessment in the pre-trial facility for youth in Mexico City. This is pre-trial only. It's a big facility in terms of infrastructure. Population ranges between 70, 80, at the most 120 youth. And some of the results from this exercise, I would say, I could mention three that are quite important. Because it's pre-trial and pre-trial lasts tops 5 months in Mexico, sometimes facilities find it whether are necessary or not as urgently to adapt the infrastructure or even inner protocols for youth with disabilities or with limited Spanish, which is the main language spoken in Mexico. And so from our tool, this need was visualized. And even though the facility rarely receives youth with disabilities, they're now working on creating protocols to properly serve this population. Another successful result from the assessment is that from the results that we presented of compliance of the standards in this tool, now there is this unique file for training of staff. In previous years, though staff was trained, there was no record on site of how much training on in which topics staff had been trained. And even though this facility has a stable staff, there's not a big rate of overturn. It was important for them to identify which areas of training could be improved over the time or the year plan of the facility. And lastly, another good successful result is that now the facility is now concluding a protocol to address prevention and reaction to suicide attempts in the facility. Even though these areas came out to be critical during the pandemic, and there was some sort of notion in the facility when it came to addressing mental health, there was no specific tool that would focus and preventing suicide and providing specific tools to staff to react to suicidal attempts within the facility. So I would say these are good results. And on that last note, in the mental health, it's quite common when we visit facilities, when we, as a facility, if you have a tool, because it would come up in the standards that talks about preventing suicide, the first response is we haven't had a suicidal attempt in whatever years, which to us, it comes as surprising. There's a difference, and the standards addresses there's a difference between suicidal attempts and maybe suicidal thoughts. Anyway, just to make the case of how important that last action from the facility was after having run the assessments. And so now I'm gonna bring this back to Douglas.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna message her that maybe the chat box hasn't been enabled during the webinar. I'm gonna see if there's a way I don't know, Sarai, if there's a way you can check on your end. I guess the Q&A box is enabled. So maybe the chat isn't going to work for participants, but the Q&A looks like it is working. So I don't know if everyone will see that or not, but go ahead and put your questions in the question and answer box, which would, on your toolbar, you should see a Q&A or questions and answers. And let me share the screen one more time here. So as kind of a last point we wanted to share, this tool is just one piece of an overall process that we conduct as an organization in the facilities where we work. And it's kind of a starting point, but it's part of this longer process that oftentimes, if we're partnering with a specific facility to go through this kind of improvement process, then the idea is that over a number of months, like in the example that I gave of the pretrial detention facility in Mexico City, we have been working, actually the project started right before the pandemic hit, but if you kind of take out the pandemic piece in the middle, we've been working with them for probably close to a year on really completing the assessment itself, writing, presenting kind of the results of that assessment to the authorities, and then going through and working on updating protocols and kind of all of the different pieces that I highlighted as far as action steps for that process to go forward. And then there's the possibility that we would do an assessment at the end of that process as well to identify kind of how successful that was. And it's a fairly thorough assessment, and so by going through that assessment, we really do get a very clear idea of kind of what are the specific areas that the facility really does need to look at. So with that, I just wanted to talk about a couple next steps that you can think about, whether you're part of civil society, whether you're part of an authority that's running a facility or somewhere kind of involved in youth justice or children's rights. We want to go ahead and continue to make sure that people have the opportunity to download the standards. There's the QR code again. We talked about adapting those standards at a national level. Then also, and these are all steps that our organization is available to discuss with how we can partner with you on these different steps, but looking at adapting those standards to the national context that I had discussed, virtual on-site training that we can provide to conducting these assessments, or getting even more involved with providing the technical assistance, including being part of leading an independent assessment of your facility. And then there is a certification process that we have designed for specifically in Mexico, but we are now adapting that process to be used, that can be used outside of Mexico as well. And in fact, we will have a follow-up webinar to discuss specifically that process and what that looks like. So there's a few additional things that we go through with the standards, where we identify kind of certain priority levels on where which standards need to be addressed first and most urgently, and then kind of what it would look like to have a facility meeting those standards at those different levels. And with that, I know that we have a few questions that Sarai has been responding to in the Q&A, but I'm not sure if everybody can see all of the questions that have been asked or have been answered. So I don't know if there's any other points that you wanted to share with folks. Sarai, I think the other piece that is important to understand when the actual assessment takes place is that this is designed to look at, and the introduction to the tool itself talks about looking at different kind of sources of information. How are you determining that a facility is meeting these standards? And so just conducting like a facility tour and speaking to the chief administrator of the facility is certainly not sufficient to identify that these standards are being met. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, Sarai, as far as kind of how would your team identify sources of information to determine that standards are being met or not?
Yes, for sure. And then lastly, just to respect everybody's time as well, it would be worth addressing the questions from the chat box. So first, in talking about the sources of information when it comes to doing running an assessment in the facility, when it's an external facility or even a self-assessment, there has to be access to all kinds of documentation in the facility. That would include logs of intake, of community referrals, all the staff, all the logs that registers what happens in the facility every day, at what time youth ate, if there was an incident, what are the policies in the facility. We also will need to interview youth and staff and family members in order to prove practices from the facility. Would you want me to include more information on the process, or should we go ahead and read the questions from the Q&A?
Sure, no, we can, if you want to go ahead and read the questions. I know you've gone through.
Yeah, so I've answered most of this. Let's start with Sarmad Ali, who's asking if we know how many children have been behind bars concerning Pakistan. So the tool is an assessment tool. In order for us to have access to hard data on detention in any jurisdiction, we would necessarily have to already be in contact with government officials from that specific jurisdiction in order for them to provide us with that hard data. Or if there's a report that has already been made from a local, maybe nonprofit or civil society. I also mentioned that the global report that Douglas mentioned previously, done by Maher Noack on children deprived of liberty, has some numbers, not all broken down by countries, but could give us an idea globally. And then Okishar Giles, I hope I'm saying this right, I'm so sorry, asks, when considering suicide prevention, does the tool take into consideration any physical features of the cells that could be used in suicide attempt, or strictly focus on mental health? And the answer is yes, the tool does provide some standards that address the physical features of cells, even the physical features of the cell when youth are being in a watched, a period of time where it has already been an attempt, and the youth has to just be under supervision. So the answer is yes.
On that point, I would just like to add, that the tool was designed with the understanding that there's a wide range of facility infrastructure, resources, that are, in different countries or in different jurisdictions. It's just a huge variation. And I mean, we've definitely seen that in our work, whether it's been in places like Indiana in the United States, or Mexico City, or other parts of Mexico itself, or other parts of Latin America that have much fewer resources that even a place like Mexico City would have. And the vast majority of the standards are around operations and around practices that take place inside the facility. So the standards are definitely, this tool is definitely important, I think, for any facility to take a look at. Another piece of that is that all of the standards are designed to be applied with a basic level of community care, meaning that youth should have access to the same level of care inside of the facility as they would within their community. So the level of let's say the level of medical care or the level of education. So they should have the same level of access to public education within the facility that they do in their communities. So the idea isn't that the facility itself, the infrastructure itself, needs to be at a certain level or a certain assumption made about what that is going to look like based on some international ideal of what a facility would look like, whatever that even means. I think it would maybe mean different things to different people, but the idea is that the standards themselves are flexible enough to be applicable, and that any facility, regardless of the amount of resources or infrastructure itself, can be improved to better protect children. There's absolutely cases where infrastructure needs to be taken a look at, especially in overcrowding situations or understaffed situations. And the standards do talk about staff to youth ratios and space and overcrowding. But in those other kind of environmental factors that Sarah, you mentioned about the environmental section, but it's important to understand that this hasn't been built with I don't know, a Geneva type of facility or a US style facility in mind.
I answer a couple more questions. We ran out of time, but the last one, Douglas, is from Kathleen Siberis. And the question is, how can the facility I work for contact you for your support in assessing, training, and implementation of the standards? And answering this, with this, we can wrap it up.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I'm going to go ahead and add our email addresses to the chat here. And we'll also be emailing out a summary then from this event for everybody who participated, to make sure people have had a chance to download, and then with additional contact information. And then we'll also make sure everyone gets a notification about the facility certification webinar that we'll be having at the beginning of 2024. But yeah, the best way would be to go ahead and email us to discuss that. And so with that, I really want to thank everybody who participated in this webinar. It's a very important topic, and that as long as you continue to be incarcerated, I think the international community, civil society, governments need to continue to prioritize their health and well-being. Thank you all.
Thank you all.